Hello and welcome to this episode of the World Deciphered. I'm your host, Cipher Brief CEO and publisher, Suzanne Kelly. In this week's episode, the U.S. is just weeks away from a presidential election. We're talking with U.S. Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Matt Olsen, about increased efforts by Russia, China, and Iran to influence the outcome. This, as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky didn't exactly have the trip to the U.S. he was hoping for. We'll have a roundup from the Cipher Brief newsroom. And Israel's defense ministry tells its troops to prepare for a ground invasion. We're talking about what that could mean for the region with Ambassador Gary Grappo. And former senior CIA officer and six-time station chief Ralph Goff talks to the Cipher Brief about why he's so concerned about the dynamics playing out in the Middle East right now. But first, let's get a check of the headlines really driving the global news cycle this week from the Cipher Brief newsroom with Tom Nagorski. Tom?
Thanks, Suzanne. Well, this week, in a nutshell, we have two major wars, various plans for peace, and no endgame in sight for either one of them. In the Middle East, after nearly a year of worrying that the Israelis might open a second front in the north against Hezbollah in Lebanon, they've done exactly that all week long, bombing Hezbollah targets, mostly in southern Lebanon, taking out a lot of military assets, but also killing many Lebanese civilians. And now there are warnings that an Israeli ground invasion may be next. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in New York at the moment. He says his country will not stop the attacks against Hezbollah until, quote, we achieve all our objectives. And as you know, the main objective is to make northern Israel safe for some 70,000 residents to return to their homes there. Experts are divided as to how long that may take and whether it's even possible in the long run. So now, after all the global diplomacy aimed at a ceasefire in Gaza, the U.S. and others are scrambling to halt the fighting in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. And then to Ukraine, where this week the major news on that war came from New York and Washington. At the United Nations, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky made a passionate plea for defeating Russia and specifically for lifting those restrictions on Ukraine that keep it from attacking military targets inside Russian territory. One phrase heard over and over again this week from many European diplomats: Ukraine is being forced to fight with one hand tied behind its back. Zelensky then went to Washington, bringing his so-called plan for victory to the White House and to Capitol Hill. He got a lot of rhetorical support and promises of more financial support. Still no American commitment to drop those restrictions on long-range weapons. And so for now, Ukraine continues to fight with that one hand tied behind its back. And Suzanne, almost no one thought either of these wars in the Middle East or Ukraine would be lasting as long as they have. And at the moment, there's no end in sight for either one of them. Back to you.
You probably already know that the Cipher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cipher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cipher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at thecipherbrief.com.
Welcome back to the World Deciphered. I'm Suzanne Kelly. You know, the U.S. is now just weeks away from the U.S. presidential election, and efforts by Russia, China, and Iran to influence the outcome of that election are really ramping up. That's according to the U.S. Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Matt Olsen. We sat down with him this week to talk about everything from the election to the rising threat of terrorism across the country.
If you just look at the counterterrorism landscape, whether we're talking about some of the implications of the Hamas attack from October 7th to domestic terrorism, there are multiple vectors that we're concerned about when it comes to counterterrorism, and continue to be concerned about even actors within the United States inspired by ISIS. So that remains particularly challenging and dynamic. But as everyone has talked about for a few years, the range of threats we face from nation states has become just increasingly a focus of our work at the Justice Department, and that just reflects the same threat landscape that my colleagues across the government are working on, and that ranges from traditional espionage to sending our sensitive technologies to authoritarian countries like Russia and Iran, and to acts of transnational repression inside the United States carried out by China, and as well as lethal plotting by Iran targeting dissidents as well as former officials inside the United States. So if you just add all that together and just the threat landscape, and again, I take it from the perspective right now, as you introduced me as a Justice Department person, our job is working with the FBI and the intelligence community to investigate and prosecute cases. But we sort of see that entire threat landscape. I sit with the Attorney General and the FBI Director every morning. We get the President's daily brief and we talk about these threats, and it has been just an extraordinarily busy period. And some of that, frankly, I think we might talk about this, but some of that is related to the election and some of the actions we're seeing from foreign adversaries around our election and trying to interfere with our election. So maybe I'll stop there and we can turn to more specific threats. But I just know folks are really busy in the government, and I think and the people on this call reflect that as well.
Yeah, let's dig into a couple of these, and I do want to talk about elections in a little bit, but first, why don't we start kind of with a geopolitical look? You've made some announcement recently regarding China and regarding Russia. Top of mind for you right now in terms of the behaviors that you're seeing out there that are causing either cyber issues or other types of disruptive activities. You've made a couple of announcements in the press. There was a 32-page indictment filed, I think maybe just about 2 weeks ago now, where you're really focused in on disinformation and efforts for propaganda, things like that. Let's talk either China, Russia, wherever you want to start.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because I do think, and maybe just recency effect, but I'm coming out of a meeting just a moment ago talking about these cases. And so what we're really focused right now on is foreign election interference. And look, I think from one vantage point, the threats that we're facing from Iran, Russia, and China in particular, when it comes to our election, are as significant as ever. They are determined and persistent in their efforts to influence our elections, and that can mean a range of things, from sowing discord and trying to accelerate divisions within our society, to actually supporting one candidate or one party over the other. And so those efforts are really challenging, and they're kind of turbocharged by the use of artificial intelligence to increase the scale and reach and resonance of the messaging, as well as traditional sort of spear phishing attacks and the like. So the tactics are relatively sophisticated, and their efforts are like, we're just seeing a real persistent and an accelerated amount of activity, particularly from Russia, but also from Iran, I would say. So that's on one side. I would say on the other side, I think we should acknowledge that the intelligence community is really forward-leaning in providing public statements. They've issued 3 unclassified statements over the past couple of months, at the 100-day mark from the election, 60-day, and now 45-day mark just a couple of days ago, where unclassified intelligence community coming from the Director of National Intelligence statements about, here's what the threats we face, here's what we can talk about, here are the tactics they're using. I think that's a reflection of real lessons learned from past elections, particularly 2016, to inform citizens about this activity and help build resilience within our society. For our part at the Justice Department and the FBI, we've been very aggressive in calling this activity out, and the way we do that is through our charging documents. And we brought a couple of cases involving Russia in the very recent past. Just to go into those in a little bit of detail, because I think they are really significant cases. One involved RT, formerly Russia Today. This is the arm of the Kremlin, and it had set up basically a $10 million scheme is what we're charging, to use a company based in Tennessee, an American company, and use that company to send propaganda, its propaganda, to influencers on the internet. And these influencers not necessarily witting of what was happening, but effectively acting as the mouthpiece of Putin and interfering in our elections by issuing propaganda of Russia and disinformation. In another case, sort of a related but separate case, we call it the doppelganger effort by Russia, which was, they basically had used internet domains largely as fake news sites like Washington Post, Fox News. Looks just like Washington Post and Fox News, except it's totally fake and was used to send out Russian propaganda to American audiences. And then we've recently also, just a few days ago, called out Iran for its efforts to interfere in the elections through targeted spearfishing campaign against the former president's campaign. So if I may, Suzanne, one question I think that I get asked pretty regularly, and maybe it's on your mind or the minds of folks watching, why do we care, or why should people care about this, right? It's just, and maybe it's obvious to this, this group, but I do think it's worth, addressing that question. And that is, from my vantage point, why people should care and why we really are trying to sound the alarm here is that, elections are the foundation of our democracy. What makes us different from Russia and China and Iran and authoritarian countries is that we have free and fair elections, and we have to defend those elections. And the right to vote, the choices we make in our elections, those are the choices for American citizens and American citizens alone. And when foreign countries try to influence those choices, and they do so covertly or secretly, that violates our laws. And we need to enforce those laws in order to defend our elections, because, again, when those countries seek to undermine our democracy by sowing discord in the United States or by serving their own interests at the expense of ours, that's fundamentally undermining to our democracy. So I think this could not be a more important set of issues, and I think that's why we in the Justice Department, along with others in the government, are taking it so seriously.
I think I really appreciate your perspective on this for a few reasons. One being, this is very difficult for the average person to be able to identify what is propaganda and what the source is for information that they're being pushed, that's being pushed to them. But you actually have the perspective of understanding how the chain works from A to Z, where most people don't. So in an environment where it's extremely difficult, we're all getting data so quickly on our phones, on our computers, whatever it might be. It's tough to keep up. We want to make a quick decision, and then we want to go ahead and share something if it sounds interesting. We want to look smart, whatever reason. But you're actually seeing how, the sort of behind the curtain. What is your thinking about sort of how people need to be reconsidering the sources of material? Because as you mentioned in one of the cases that was brought by your department, some people may have been used unwittingly. So how do you, I know you're not a policy person, you're a prosecutor, but how do you deal with that? And how are you thinking about the problem on a broader scale?
I totally agree that is the challenge. And I do think that, look, on the threat side, these countries, they see our elections as moments of vulnerability for us. And that's why they're ramping up their overall, threat activity, propaganda, and disinformation around our elections. So they see this as in their interest to do this. So what does that mean, for us? How do we, how do we defend ourselves? And I just think, one of the main ways is through transparency. And that's what I think it's such a significant development that the Intelligence Committee is issuing these bulletins, these warnings. It's why we're bringing these cases. To me, there's nothing quite like a Justice Department. Now, this may be me speaking from, my particular vantage point as a DOJ lawyer, but when the Justice Department brings an indictment and we say, these are the allegations that we are prepared to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in an open courtroom, we are standing behind these allegations. That's a very strong statement of what we believe the truth to be and what we're prepared to do to demonstrate that. And so, again, fundamentally, what we're trying to do is shine a bright light on this activity to bring it to the public's attention in a way that will help the public be skeptical when they see something, like they see what looks like the Washington Post and it says a headline. I'm making this up, but we put out the actual headlines. But it's, one of their main goals is to undermine U.S. support for Ukraine. That's one of the primary goals, right? So they all want a headline like, Ukraine losing to Russia, or like that. I think a discerning reader, it requires a degree of discernment and skepticism on the part of the electorate. But you look at that and like people should be questioning it, just like we question or should be questioning everything we see, right? To some degree. But this is I'm not saying it's easy, and I think it can be hard, and I do think that they have decided, these authoritarian countries have decided that it is in their interests to interfere in our elections because they understand there's consequences, and they understand that that this is a time when we are vulnerable. So they are trying to pursue their own national security interests at the expense of ours through these efforts.
Just ahead, Cipher Brief managing editor Tom Nagorski sits down with Ambassador Gary Grappo to talk about the escalation this week in the Middle East and what he thinks it means. But first, this public service message from the Cipher Brief.
The cost of armed conflict is high. In the modern world, to weaken the most powerful democracies, authoritarian regimes rely on more sneaky sabotage. It's guerrilla warfare, not on the field, but online. Their ammunition is disinformation, designed to sow division and dysfunction. They prey on emotions, enticing people to share links with half-truths or lies, promoting the most extreme voices that further the divide, targeting us with ads and bots that mislead, and weaponizing sensitive information to sow chaos and distrust. It's so subtle, most people don't even realize it's happening. Their disinformation campaigns target democracies with 3 overarching goals. First, divide the people. They stoke anger and inflame existing divisions to get people to turn on each other. It becomes an us versus them mentality, painting the political opposition as the enemy. In an effort to keep audiences watching and advertising dollars flowing, news sources and social media can inadvertently fan the flames of the divide, allowing disinformation to spread like wildfire. Second, discourage compromise. By depicting political opponents as the enemy, the democratic process becomes increasingly polarized. Politicians are elected to fight, not compromise as democracy requires. The government becomes gridlocked and ineffective. Third, destroy institutional trust. With democracy gridlocked, the next step is to convince the people that their voice doesn't matter, that institutions are working against them, and elections are rigged. Believing the system is broken, people disengage as frustration and anger grow. As an alternative, some even resort to violence. With democracies weakened, authoritarian regimes fill the void, increasing their power, wealth, and control on the global stage. All without firing a shot. But democracies are built to adapt and can take steps to counter this threat. First, we must take this threat to democracy seriously. Second, we must address the structures that make democracies easy to exploit. And third, we must look for ways to reform our institutions to rebuild public trust. By taking action and working together, we can leave a healthy democratic legacy for generations to come.
Israel has launched a major bombing campaign against Hezbollah, really boosting concerns in the region that it's one more step closer to escalation. Israel's defense minister has now told troops to be ready for a ground invasion. The last time Israel fought a ground war with Hezbollah was in 2006. So, what could opening another front in Israel's war against Hamas really mean? Cipher Brief managing editor Tom Nagorski talked with Ambassador Gary Grappo, who served several posts in the Middle East during his time with the State Department. And Tom began by asking the ambassador whether war between Israel and Hezbollah has already begun.
Well, if you were to ask the two parties involved, and by the way, thank you again. It's always a pleasure to be with you and with the Cipher Brief. But if you were to ask the two contending parties here, Hezbollah and Israel, if this is a war, they would answer very strongly in the affirmative. This is most definitely a war. It's a question of level of intensity at this point. It's certainly getting far more intense on the Israeli side, with Hezbollah no doubt gearing up for a response of its own.
And vis-a-vis mission or goals on the Israeli side, let me just ask you, what do you think the Israeli mission is here, or the aim, in terms of what so far is an aerial campaign, but what do you think they seek to accomplish?
Well, as near as I can tell, and from what I understand, the Israelis want to create a buffer zone between their northern border and the Hezbollah presence in southern Lebanon. Now, under a UN Security Council resolution passed at the end of the 2006 war, the Hezbollah forces were required to withdraw to the Litani River,
right,
in Lebanon, which is roughly about 25 kilometers north of that border. I don't think, I mean, the Israelis would certainly love to have that. I don't think they would have to have that much to feel comfortable. My suspicion is a minimum of 5 and probably more like 10 kilometers of a buffer zone where there are no Hezbollah forces present, and Hezbollah does not have the ability to fire rockets or missiles from, say, some of the hilltops which have line of sight into Israel. The question remains how they're going to do that. At the moment, they seem to be relying on air attacks as well as drones, rockets, etc., artillery as well, but not a frontal assault into Lebanon itself. But that option remains very much on the table, particularly in light of comments by the Israeli military commander yesterday that orders have been given to the Israeli forces to prepare for a possible invasion of southern Lebanon.
Right. And in terms of the ultimate sort of on the ground aim, it's to get I think it's 60 or 70,000 residents of northern Israel to a point where they feel safe to go back to their homes, and they haven't been there since shortly after the October 7th attacks, right?
Right. And I mean, one has to wonder whether they would ever feel safe considering the threat that Hezbollah poses, even at a distance. But nevertheless, that's the immediate objective.
Right. And to your point about the Litani River, we should stress, again, correct me if I'm wrong, that Hezbollah made that pledge after the 2006 war, but didn't really honor it. Is that right?
No, they did not. The Israeli pledge was that they would withdraw from Lebanon, which they did do. And none of the other armed forces groups of Lebanon, namely the Lebanese armed forces, is present down there. It's only Hezbollah that poses this risk or this threat.
I was struck by a phrase that was attributed to some Israeli officers this week, saying that what they're doing now is de-escalation through escalation. In other words, I think, punish Hezbollah with the aim of deterring them. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, this has been tried before. Sometimes it has worked, and I'm not referring necessarily to just this particular conflict, but in other conflicts,
Mm-hmm.
yes, to escalate in order to de-escalate, that Hezbollah will see the very real threat that Israel poses to it and has demonstrated the capability for doing much worse. And Hezbollah then decides to perhaps withdraw from this buffer area that Israel would like to have. But you could just as easily make the case, well, this is escalation that leads to more escalation. And at the moment, neither Hezbollah nor the other members of the Axis of Resistance seem to be willing to back down.
Mm-hmm.
The United States is still pursuing some kind of a ceasefire, not only in this area, but also in Gaza. There's a lot of hope riding on that, and I don't know how probable that is right now. I'd say it's pretty improbable that they will be able to achieve either, but nevertheless, we all wish them Godspeed in those efforts. I'm not clear yet. I'm not sure yet that Hezbollah is prepared to back down, despite the significant losses that they have suffered over the course of the last, say, 10 days since the exploding pagers.
Yeah, we'll come to those in one moment. You've also raised the specter of a ground war, and as you said, there are reports, but actually public statements now from many Israelis suggesting that at least the preparations are in place. Back to the war aims or the mission, do you think a ground operation is probably necessary to achieve what they want to achieve in terms of pushing Hezbollah back and making the north safe again in Israel?
I think in order to have the level of certainty they would like to have that this southern area does not pose a threat, that they might feel they have to carry out a ground invasion of the south of Lebanon. That's not to say that they could not achieve the same objective without doing that, and I think they would prefer that, but they're preparing for the other option as well. And of course, that will then put this on a much different level. And my suspicion is that at that point, Hezbollah will begin an all-out war against Israel in the sense of dramatically increasing the number of missiles and rockets and drone attacks on Israel proper all over the country, and not just in certain targeted areas, which they've actually begun to do in sporadic fashion.
Joining us now at the World Deciphered is Ralph Goff. Ralph is a Cipher Brief expert. He is also former senior CIA officer and 6-time station chief. Ralph, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure, Suzanne. Always great to be here with the Cipher Brief.
You know, Israel has said no to a ceasefire proposal that was put forward by both the U.S. and France, and has told its military now to be ready for a ground invasion. Experts are warning, and have been warning for quite a while now, of the dangers of a two-front war. So, Ralph, I want to know, what do you think that this could mean realistically for the region if Israel moves forward with a ground invasion?
So, Suzanne, I have to tell you, I don't think there's ever been a time when it's been more difficult to predict where events will go in the Middle East. I mean, with the Israelis, I think they've the last week we've seen them pull rabbits out of the hat. They surprise the world almost on a daily basis, it seems. Meanwhile, the Iranians, usually they're the ones rattling the sabers the loudest. A friend of mine recently made the wry observation that lately it seems like the Iranians have been behaving more responsibly than Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, which, given that the Iranians came to New York and the new president there, Pervez there, he said that Iran wants peace with Israel, and then they offered to go back to the early stages of the nuclear agreement from 2015, right? So clearly they seem to be looking for a way to de-escalate. Hamas, I think, when you consider the arsenal they have, they could have fired many more rockets and missiles. I mean, we've got the first time now, one disturbing trend, a couple of ballistic missiles fired towards the heart of Israel, which is an escalation, which the Israelis were certainly not let go unanswered. And then meanwhile, Gaza seems to have been pushed almost entirely out of the press coverage, except for maybe the humanitarian aspects there, which are looking dire for the winter. So, it's a really strange brew out there. And for the pundits, it poses a challenge in you could predict the way this is going to go, and you probably got a 50-50 chance of being right or wrong. So, I feel sorry for all the people out there who are, trying to make a living at predicting where this thing is going to go.
Yeah, it has been, as you said, just really difficult to predict anything because all the players in this are not doing what one normally would have expected. And your former job used to be trying to figure out what people were going to do next. In terms of an actual ground invasion, if Netanyahu makes good on that promise that troops are already preparing for something like this, what would that do in terms of opening up the second front in a more official way, because many people say it's already been opened. But what would a ground invasion look like? What would the impact be in the area? What would you be worried about?
So, I think there's several worries. One here for the Israelis are higher casualties, right? Going into southern Lebanon has never been an easy endeavor. And it's never really worked out that well for the Israelis. Going back to the first incursion was, I think, 78 or something. Then 1982, 2006, right, the three. Each time the Israelis, they go in, they kind of achieve what they set out to do, which is to push Hezbollah back, to destroy Hezbollah combat forces. But every time, it causes a lot of pain and heartbreak back in Israel because of the casualties, right? Small country where, relatively what might seem to the West as small numbers of casualties resonate large inside Israel. And remember, the third front, the home front, or the third war, if you will, the internal political war in Israel, is kind of on hold as the Israelis unite to deal with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, but it's simmering still. So an incursion into southern Lebanon will not just have military ramifications for Israel, there will be political ramifications. And meanwhile, there are signs that Hezbollah, I think there are probably amongst the survivors of the military leadership there, which the Israelis have really put on an intel show, as it were, in taking out Hezbollah military leadership. But I'm sure there's a lot of them that are spoiling for a fight. Right? They look at a ground incursion as the great equalizer between their forces and the Israelis. So, I think while the Lebanese people will be caught in the crossfire and will surely be made to suffer, Hezbollah, I think they welcome an incursion.
I want to get to that incredible sort of pager attack in just a minute and the impact that had on Hezbollah. But first, I want to stick with Israel for just a moment and ask you, it's said that it's determined to make northern Israel safe enough for the return of some 70,000 Israelis who have been forced from their homes there. Do you believe that the current campaign would be able to accomplish that?
That's another hard one to say. The Israelis have in the past had some success in pushing Hezbollah's combat capabilities back out of range and bringing quiet to the north. I think in this case, it's going to matter just how much combat capability from Hezbollah that the Israelis can exhaust, whether they can bring peace to the north or not. There's an interesting phenomenon I noticed, though, in several press pieces that, the Netanyahu government, when they were dealing mostly with Gaza, their popularity was declining, right? And there was strife within the government, very public spat between the Minister of Defense and Bibi, Prime Minister Netanyahu. Meanwhile, as Israeli forces take on Hezbollah and fight in the north, the popularity of Likud and Netanyahu has risen, right? So if you look at Bibi as the consummate politician, he's noticed these trends. So for him, pushing hard in the north is paying political dividends for him and his party. So this is, I think, maybe wasn't totally expected, but it does give more impetus for Bibi to push forward with plans to launch an incursion into Lebanon.
Yeah, Israeli officials have really described their strategy, Ralph, as de-escalation through escalation. In other words,
Right.
punish Hezbollah to deter them. Is that likely to work, do you think?
Yeah, this has become another one of those new catchphrases, right? Escalate to de-escalate and escalation dominance, right? I heard a lot of that talk when I was out in the Middle East, and yes and no. Yes, they can achieve de-escalation in the short term, but this is an area where grudges and memories last long, and so the Israelis may be successful in achieving some sort of de-escalation in the short term, but they'll be leaving an enemy that's spoiling for revenge at some point, which means that future escalation would be the norm there. I mean, one thing I think a lot of us learned in the war on terror is you can't kill your way out of a problem. Right? Mm-hmm. That's a short-term solution, gives you a tactical advantage, but strategically, you've got to find a way to either vanquish your enemy or find a way to come to some sort of agreement. And I don't see either outcome happening at present.
So let me ask you then, is a ground operation even necessary for Israel to be able to deter Hezbollah and have the impact that it wants to have? Does it need a ground operation?
I don't think they do. And a part of me sees this stuff, like I saw Israeli media coverage of Herzi Halevi, right, the chief of staff out with the troops talking about a ground incursion, preparing them. It almost seemed like a disinformation campaign, if you will, like kind of signaling, like in boxing, you signal with your left and then knock your foe out with the right. And I'm wondering if this is a case where they're just trying to convince Hezbollah that they're coming in a land attack, but they're going to just maybe ramp up the targeting from what has so far been a very successful air campaign, right? Yeah. And in the meantime, like I said, Hezbollah still has a lot of missiles and rockets in their inventory, but the Israelis have shown a remarkable capability to knock them out in flight, right? Like the ballistic missile that was reportedly headed for Mossad headquarters, right? Which I'm sure makes the employees there feel rather jumpy. And then, of course, within minutes, the Israeli Air Force is bombing the locations from where those rockets are fired. So I think Hezbollah, there's a lot of makes a lot of sense for them to be careful what they launch and when.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk for a minute about what's happened to the leadership of Hezbollah, especially because of that really kind of unprecedented attack with the batteries that were laden with explosives. The damage now, we've had a little bit more than a week to kind of assess the actual damage. What do you think in terms of what that actually did to Hezbollah's leadership, and maybe more importantly, the psychological effect of that on Hezbollah leaders?
Yeah, I mean, with the pager attack, that took them completely by surprise. That was as brilliant a supply chain operation as I can think of in my long career. The Israelis are good at that, but in this one, they took it to a whole new level. Not only did they control the supply chain, they controlled the production. Right? If some of the press reporting is to believe, they actually produced the devices. Right? So they didn't just sneak into the supply chain; they took it over. With the radios, I think it was similar, but with the radios, it seems to me like I was kind of confused why they did that, because taking out that type of communications system would be something you do before you invade, before you go on the ground invasion, and they didn't do that. So that tells me that after the pagers went off, the Israelis probably decided, hey, we've got other tricks up our sleeve, but because of the exposure of the pagers, these guys aren't stupid. They're probably going to start ditching everything electronic. So let's set them off now while they can still cause casualties there. So another brilliant operation. And I would say that in neither case would an operation like either one of those be approved by any American government to be used by the American intelligence services.
Yeah.
It's just too unpredictable.
You talked about how difficult it is really at the very beginning of our conversation to predict what's going to happen next. But how do you see at least one or two possibilities of the conflict with Hezbollah ending?
Yeah. So one possibility is the two sides gradually reach a point of exhaustion, right, without dealing a knockout punch to either side. I think that's the more likely outcome. The other is, and very unlikely though, is that somehow the world community gets together and puts enough pressure on the Israelis to reach some sort of agreement. I mean, there was a faint ray of hope was given a couple of years ago when Israel and Lebanon worked out a deal for the maritime border for the gas and oil exploitation in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is the first time that Lebanon sort of tacitly recognized Israel, right, and reached an agreement and ratcheted down the tension. So there is precedent there when it comes into each state's interest to find a way out. So at some point, when the people in Lebanon get tired of being bombed out of their houses, and when the people of Israel get tired of living in shelters, and when the fighting forces on both sides get tired of being on full-scale alert, maybe there's a way they can ratchet this thing back.
That's it for this edition of the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host this week, Cipher Brief CEO and publisher Suzanne Kelly. I want to also remind you that you can find the full interviews with all of our guests on today's show at the Cipher Brief's YouTube channel. And please follow us along at thecipherbrief.com all week as we bring you expert insights, analysis, and reporting on the stories that are most impacting national and global security. Be sure to join us again next week for more of the deep insights you've come to expect from the Cipher Brief. Once again, we'll see you next week. Take care.